Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the Treasury Update podcast, host Craig Jeffery checks in with Kyriba's VP of Strategy, Bob Stark, in a wide-range discussion covering numerous topics. They share valuable insights into the impact of technology on jobs, the movement to the cloud by ERP systems, changes in digital currency dynamics, and increasing standards on payment security. Listen in on this free-range discussion.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, Bob. Glad to have you on again.
Glad to be here, Craig. It's always fun, and I look forward to this podcast.
I want to start off on the technology's impact on our jobs. There's a tremendous amount of technologies impacting our jobs. Some people are very concerned, some are excited. How is technology impacting our jobs, or how will it impact our jobs?
Well, I like the way you asked that question, because the way technology will impact our jobs is it's going to become more difficult to just do the status quo. And the reason why I say it like that is that we have these technologies such as robotic process automation, and really more specifically, more artificial intelligent technologies like machine learning that are just around the corner. We're starting to see these a little bit in Treasury, a little bit in finance, but certainly in other parts of organizations, which give us good insight into what's expected. And what's expected is that it's not just automation. It's going to help in the decision-making, help in the analysis. And, Craig, you rightly point out, people embrace that to a point, but then they also start wondering, well, wait a second, that's what I do in Treasury. I make decisions based on understanding information and assessing data. Is this going to replace what I do? That's a very reasonable question, I think. But I also think, this is things we've talked about before on podcasts, if you're willing to understand how can things be different, then yes, you'll still have a job. It'll be just a better job, because a lot of the processing of information, the collecting of information, that part can go away, and you can focus on really analyzing, is this the best decision still going forward for our organization, for our team?
If that change is happening, there's going to be some people who resist change, and they're the types that aren't listening to this podcast, so we can say those things. Those that are listening are always looking at how to adjust and adapt. There's a lot of change going on. If you think about some of the things you just said with robotic process automation or machine learning, it takes away certain types of tasks. You listed a few. So what does the mindset need to be for the Treasury person to make sure they stay ahead of rather than behind the curve with these changes? Because some of the changes are in, some of them are rolling out more expansively, and others are a little farther down the road. What's a good approach to try to stay near the front of that?
Yeah, well, at this early stage, I would say the first thing is to understand, what kind of scenarios does an artificially intelligent technology, what is that going to help with? And there's some easy answers, such as it can help me forecast better. It can help me detect anomalies in terms of payments that maybe aren't quite right. It can sniff those out a little bit more easily than maybe looking at it with your eyes. Or even it can improve reconciliation just by looking at data to understand how do we deal with manual variances, and it can take those manual variances and automate them for you based on understanding how you would typically deal with those types of transactions. So there's scenarios like that, or use cases that if Treasury starts thinking about, is this possible? You start asking those questions, you actually put yourself in a really good position to embrace what's possible, but also drive what's possible. And I think that's the key part, Craig, is if you can be in control, in the driver's seat of, here are the things that we'd like to do better, can the technology help us? That's a very positive way of looking at it, and certainly a way to be in front rather than reacting to what's coming.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of that movie. There was a fairly recent movie. It was about NASA, and there was a bunch of ladies who were doing calculations. They were the calculators, or people were the calculators, and it was a group of them doing that. And then there was this idea of a new, I think an IBM computer was coming in, and they were learning how to use it ahead of time. They were saying, hey, this is going to change what goes on. and getting ahead of the curve so that they could adapt to new, more powerful tools, whether it's a shovel to a backhoe to a giant earth mover, whether it's a abacus, slide rule, calculator. That's the type of activity or approach that you're suggesting.
Always. In Treasury, we've seen change. I think maybe the most recent technology revolution would be moving from spreadsheets to a Treasury workstation, a Treasury management system. There were many people that thought, oh my goodness, that's all I do every single day, and it's just automated away. But yet, we didn't really see people go away. We certainly saw jobs change, and we saw maybe the first half of your day be automated into 5 minutes, meaning that what you did in the afternoons or didn't get to as a project suddenly became the large part of your job. That's kind of what we're looking at here, is what can we do that's more value added, that's better for the organization? What are those great projects you think, oh, I wish I had time for that? That's definitely what automation can help with. But then also let's think about what decisions can we make more efficiently if we had the time to analyze the data. And that's really where we get to with things like artificial intelligence. It's going to help analyze data to help make a better decision so that you can decide, is that the right decision within our treasury policy, as an example. So if you look at FX or investments, etc. So I think there's lots of interest to come, but to your original question, what can Treasury do? Treasury can start to understand what can we do better, and will this technology help us? And that's really going to help drive the change and put you in a great career position because you're the one with the expertise.
And I think there's differences. I'd love to talk maybe on another podcast or just at some event that we both attend about how that's different, let's say an audit firm versus a treasury group versus an area that's doing recon. There's, some of these areas have massive numbers of people, and this technology does a massive amount of replacement of functions and staff, whereas treasuries tend to be fairly limited in terms of number of people. They've got a tremendous backlog of things they should be doing, and so it allows them to have more power and leverage to do this range of high-value tasks that they're not always getting time to do. So I think there's a lot of promise for Treasury, and some other areas there's going to be more disruption to positions than we might see in Treasury, but it really holds promise, I think. But let's move to point number 2 or section number 2 that I wanted to talk about or hear your thoughts on, the implications of the movement to the cloud. And a lot of people on this podcast hear about what that means from a treasury management system perspective, and obviously you're in a company that's cloud, SaaS enabled. But what are the implications of the movement to the cloud when we look at accounting-oriented systems like ERP platforms? What have you been hearing? What kind of conversations have you had with your clients as more and more of these companies are porting their ERPs, their accounting systems, from an installed solution into the cloud? This is a huge push. It's been going on for a number of years now, and there seems to be an extreme amount of momentum there. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that movement to the cloud, because in Treasury, we've been through this and we understand what the benefits are. IT is no longer involved to support our Treasury platforms, but the cloud means that we don't need them anymore. The no more upgrades, it's just updates that happen for you. There's no more concern about disaster recovery and how do we deal with that, because our cloud providers offer those services. So these are all benefits that we're pretty used to in Treasury, whether it's a TMS, whether it's your trading portals, whether it's your market data platform. We've just done it, and we've had these systems for 5 to 10 years at least. But the interesting part about the ERP is that they typically haven't had these platforms. I mean, yes, there's cloud systems, like NetSuite, Workday, Microsoft's platforms, for the large part have been cloud for a little bit. But if you look at SAP and Oracle, which are the two ERP systems that dominate the market, what they're going through right now is this move to either S/4HANA on the SAP side or Oracle Cloud for Oracle. And it's interesting for us in Treasury to kind of observe from afar to see not only the difficulty of that transition and some of the different thoughts that are there, but also what we see is this opening up of the requirements to ensure that the way things were done in the old version of the ERP are still the right processes, the right procedures, the right technology for things like, say, payments and connectivity, which we understand very well in Treasury, that it's the right way of going about those. What we're finding is that as these migrations are starting to happen, and most organizations are just beginning this process, either doing it or thinking about it and planning for it in their schedules, we're seeing some interesting, I guess we'll say, market patterns that are coming up in payments. One of those is this move to APIs that we see in the banking world. The second one is this harmonization to more of an XML ISO 20022 format from Swift MT formats. Swift made that, I guess, that announcement, if you want to call it that, a little while ago. And by the end of 2021, they want to do away with MT formats, which means that for those organizations that were, say, connecting to their banks via FTP, or they were connecting to their banks using MT 101s as an example, these are things that will have to change. And so what it means is that it's not just for the ERP projects, just replicating how did we connect to the bank and what formats did we use. It's, wait a second, we need to actually make sure we're a little bit more resilient to these technology changes that are coming. And as a result, the requirements for AP and even treasury, if those are run out of the ERP, are changing. And it becomes a bit of an IT exercise. So there's a significant acceleration that can happen where treasury can say, wait a second, we know how these formats work. We understand this connectivity. We're doing this on the treasury side. We can help you make sure that you can not spend an extra 6 months in your project trying to figure this out. We can streamline that for you. So it's an interesting conversation that treasury can influence and really help accelerate the movement of these ERP migrations, at least for the parts of payments and connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. That idea, you mentioned influence and acceleration of some of these changes. I mean, moving to a much more robust format, one that's modern, takes advantage of XML, leverages the ability to enrich that, have a more resilient type of connection or method of making changes, right? If you add another piece of data into a file, it doesn't break the process where the old methods would break a process. Do you see that this is an opportunity for Treasury to provide more oversight, more control and governance of all of the payment flows, protecting the payment flows in the organization, or just an advisor to other areas?
Well, it's a good question about what Treasury's role can be. Certainly, advisor is maybe the simpler form, but there is an opportunity to centralize and standardize visibility and controls. Just in a simple scenario, a lot of organizations where they have disparate process between, say, what AP's sending to the bank in terms of payments and what Treasury is doing, Treasury doesn't know what is happening at the bank until they see their intraday file. And as a result, there is let's say, inefficiency around how cash is managed. You're leaving money in the bank because you're hoping that you know exactly what what AP is going to actually send through. So centralizing that visibility so that Treasury is part of that and can see in real time, here's what we need to fund, allows you to be more efficient with the deployment of your cash and mobilization. So yes, there's definitely an opportunity in the visibility. The controls, well, I think we all understand the threat of fraud and cybercrime. It remains, for those in the payment space, the biggest issue that they need to conquer. Having a consistent set of controls so that no matter whether a payment is initiated from your ERP, it's initiated from Treasury, it's requested by the CEO on an emergency basis when they're out of town, which obviously can be dangerous. We want to make sure that these payments are handled in a consistent manner aligned with policy. And if you have different ways of connecting without that centralized oversight, you do create risk and you create a scenario that could be exploited by those looking to commit some sort of fraud and cybercrime.
I completely agree with that. That's an area of tremendous exposure, and we see Treasury as being much more mature in hardening their payment processes. They're attuned to it. AP, payroll, there's lots of decentralized areas that handle those in companies, and so the knowledge is dispersed, whereas Treasury is centralized, focused on that, and it needs a much more robust footing. So thanks for sharing that. And in our free range discussion, let's jump over to digital currency. What's changing with digital currency? And if you're listening and you're about ready to turn it off because you didn't want to hear about digital currency, I invite you to listen in for a few minutes. And Bob, you know that I've always been skeptical of any type of digital currency that has an anonymous factor to it, due to terrorism and what country governments are doing and centralized governments are doing to protect the flow of funds and make sure that it's not going to criminal or terroristic purposes. So I've always been skeptical about that. But with that said, what are your thoughts? Will digital currencies eventually become a game changer, or will they just be an interesting spectacle?
Sure. It's an interesting question about cryptocurrencies or digital currencies. I mean, I've always said, and we've talked many a times about things like Bitcoin, which is effectively a commodity. It's a toy currency that's not meant for prime time. It doesn't have the stability, the liquidity, doesn't have the supply. And certainly, to your point, it doesn't have the controls or visibility to really protect against bad things happening. So you see things like ransomware being demanded in Bitcoin for the simple reason that it can't be tracked. And that's dangerous, in addition to the other things which make it difficult for a treasury to ever consider, or corporate to ever consider. One thing that's going on, interestingly, I think many of us have seen the press and media attention around Libra. You have Mark Zuckerberg being brought out to talk about Libra, but in fairness, talk about Facebook and privacy as well. But the reason that attention is being put on Libra is simply because Facebook and their consortium of, let's say, investors, but I'd almost say the entourage of organizations that see digital currency as an opportunity, they're, in my mind, effectively reacting to what already started in China many years ago. So China's DCEP, or Digital Currency Electronic Payment Project, that's been going on for several years, is making progress. We don't know a lot about it, certainly at this point, but what we do know is that one of their main objectives, and this ties into your point, is to ensure that that anonymity is not part of this, that they want the transparency, they want the control to ensure that it can be used for legitimate purposes. And if you combine that DCEP project, or the Digital Currency State project in China, with the popularity of messaging platforms like WeChat, as an example, that is incredibly popular in China. And I say incredibly popular, way more popular than, say, Facebook or PayPal or some of the different messaging/payment platforms we have here in the Western world. You can appreciate that this is going to be a significant player and mover in the digital game, and in fact, in e-commerce in general. So Libra is more or less a reaction to that, so that we have different alternatives. So that in the United States and Europe, we may have choices if we want to go down the path of digital currency. And my opinion is that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so someday, maybe it's 5 years from now, maybe it's 10, maybe it's longer, we will see digital currencies be that alternative asset compared to a USD or a euro or other types of currencies that we utilize today in different countries. So is it ready yet? No. But the idea, and I think some of the mechanics and some of the thought process and objectives that they're trying to build into it, especially with Libra, really recognizing that having regulation is a key part of their success, that is a very different direction than, say, a Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies of late, which really weren't designed or set up in that way. And certainly we're never going to achieve mainstream success, in part because of the factors of anonymity.
So we're going to be hedging a cryptocurrency against some of the standard currencies at some point then?
Yeah, it'll be an interesting, I guess I'm going to say foreign exchange market. But yeah, I honestly think we will. I mean, this can go many different directions, but if you get the liquidity, if you get certainly the regulation and hence support of government bodies, then it really paves the way for these digital currencies to be utilized in commerce like a fiat currency is today. And you can see some of the advantages of not having to exchange back and forth. You know, all the spreads that go into it, the difficulty in cross-border payments in terms of the additional cost. A lot of these mechanisms and constraints are different. when you're talking about digital currency, if it's done the right way. So yeah, I think there is a possibility that this just becomes yet another currency in our basket that corps are going to have to deal with. Could be interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to go with probably not. We won't be hedging in the future on that, but I think the other things you say are quite good because why couldn't it be a digital multi-currency that tracks to some of the main ones? But anyway, yeah, you bring up some great points on the stability, liquidity, and controls.
Well, that's okay. I think it's an interesting part of the discussion is what will the role be? Your point around to map it to multi-currencies, are there going to be hard exchange rates, USD to euro, kind of like we saw in the yuan where it was pegged to certain currencies? Are we going to see a Libra pegged to on a fixed basis or a range like the yuan is now to US dollar or euro as an example? Or will we see, I'm not sure we're going to see it quite in our lifetime, but will we see fiat currencies evaporate because all the advantages of having a globally regulated digital currency are just so much more than dealing with these nationally backed currencies? It's interesting to see how it plays out,
You probably remember Orbian credits. I mean, obviously Orbian's around an SCF type solution or an SCF solution. And they used to have Orbian credits, and their thing was, well, now you don't have to worry about exchanging back and forth. And I was like, I always thought that was kind of interesting. It's like, we're going to simplify foreign exchange and trade and transactions by adding another currency that we have to have take off. And I'm like, there's something that doesn't quite work with that. And obviously they've abandoned the Orbian credit many years ago. So I always think the others will fall too.
Well, it might. I don't really know how it'll play out either. But I think if you get the state backing, and that's the critical part that I think is really more complicated than a lot of people appreciate. One, just saying the anonymity, because that's one of the things that China said is important. And the US is suggesting that that's a requirement in terms of even letting Libra proliferate at all. But the other aspect is that the currencies are a tool that governments use to, make the economy work or not. I mean, it's a lever that they use. They say they just use interest rates, but we all know they utilize currencies. There's a certain level that they want currencies to be at. I mean, in Canada, we certainly have that. We recognize that there's a sweet spot where imports and exports are relatively balanced. But if it's too high or too low, then we have problems. And US is the same. Certainly certain like non-Euro countries have this challenge. So to give up that lever is dangerous for a lot of countries. And so I think it'll be difficult to really get state participation in terms of really mapping it, like pegging it to a multi-currency. I think it would be, okay, multi-currency, you can go operate. We'll let you do that, but we're not going to prioritize that over our own currency. And then what does that really mean? What is the Libra? What's the future of it if it's sort of not really prioritized and it's still, not the currency of choice for any region? It'd be interesting to see what that really means for it.
Bob, let's shift to another topic in this free-range discussion is fraud and control. We've seen increased standards around payment security for card, the PCI DSS standard, payment card industry data security standards. We've seen the emergence of SWIFT CSP, the Customer Security Program, which is still fairly new, but as the second and third and other iterations are coming out, there's things that are changing. So what's going on in terms of the change? Maybe you can cover some of the biggest changes that you see, and then we can talk about implications.
Sure. Well, there's definitely a lot changing always around organizations trying to figure out how do we become resilient to fraud and cybercrime? How do we improve the security of our payment workflows? One of the most interesting changes relatively recently is for those that use SWIFT, part of the Customer Security Program or CSP, is this mandate to use multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. And what that means, and I think most people know what it means because we're used to it in the banking world, is that you have a user ID, you have a password, and then you have yet another password that's on a different device, the key being a different device. So that if someone takes your user ID and password, that doesn't give them privilege and ability to get into your system and do bad things. And so this concept isn't new at all. But what is interesting is that many software systems, such as treasury management systems, ERP systems that access SWIFT, they don't necessarily mandate these requirements, like these capabilities to have two-factor authentication. They all, for the most part anyway, they all seem to have them, but they don't necessarily require them. And so SWIFT put a line in the sand this year by saying that multi-factor authentication is mandatory if you are going to initiate payments on the SWIFT network. So via SWIFT Alliance Lite 2 or through your service bureau or what have you. And it's not necessarily a big change, Craig. I don't know if I'd put it that category, but it's a very welcome change because it enforces a practice that everyone should be doing anyways. I like that stick versus carrot. I usually prefer carrot. Like, let's create some value. Let's create a good reason to have change or transformation. But in this case, it's a bit of a stick saying you have to do this. And it is a good practice, and I'm glad it's happening. It's small, but it will make a difference in terms of organizations being able to know that keeping that user ID and password is still important, but if somehow that gets lost and compromised, it doesn't mean that payments are going to be initiated in a platform without your knowing it. And that's where I think it's a really big impact.
Enforcing an additional layer, which has to be considered a standard of good corporate conduct, a minimum standard that organizations should use for critical confidential information, and certainly movement of funds or value. We can talk about hardware and software and the human element. Is the human element the farthest behind on the defense standards right now? Are people the weakest link?
People are definitely the weakest link. That's probably not going to change anytime soon because people have information, and information, when pieced together, can create a very complex scheme that's difficult to defend against. I mean, that's phishing, social engineering. There's lots of different words around that, but they all effectively mean the same thing, that people are the first line of defense and sometimes, unfortunately, the last line of defense. I say unfortunately because ideally you would have the awareness factor, you would do the right things, not give out information, not just change payment instructions because you were emailed by someone that said you should. These sorts of, we'll say, policy compliance that most organizations suggest should happen, but doesn't always. I always like to say, though, that the technology should enforce the controls that you want. So if the human element is compromised, let's just say they change payment instructions and there's suddenly a new bank account for a supplier, that you should have the technology detect in the back end, oh, wait a second, this is a payment to a new account that we haven't seen before. Let's quarantine it just for a little bit to make sure everything was done legitimately, and it really is the change that we're looking for. So yes, there's a human element that is probably the weakest link and probably will be for a long time, but you can put in technology that can help you ensure that your policy is being complied with. So I think there's a balance in terms of solutions. Yes, making people more aware, but yes, making your technology a little bit more resilient to help and enforce those policies that you have.
People are good at helping to defeat the security layers that are put in technologically. I agree with you that they can be the weakest link, and that they need to be updated, just like we update our antivirus and other elements of control. Bob, our last area that I wanted to ask you about, hear your thoughts on APIs in real time. This is the concept of, we've come from a batch world, payments for, payroll, we send it on a Wednesday, the money moves on a Friday, we get prior day reporting, and now there's so much that helps support faster activities. Real-time payments is one type of payment that has a speed component. The use of APIs versus SFTP or other methods of transferring funds. What are some of the things that are driving us towards faster activities and cycle times? And how is this impacting Treasury in particular?
There are two benefits of APIs, and we're starting to see this as banks have finally embraced this idea of APIs versus file transfer for connectivity to Treasury systems and to ERP. The first benefit of APIs, real time, just like you mentioned. And that really means two different things for us in Treasury. One is this idea of real-time payments and acknowledgements. That can mean different payment channels. So we see like SEPA instant payments in the EU. We see the clearinghouses real-time payments project. We see the Fed actually weighing into this to create their own alternative option. And we continue to see in other regions more real-time options. So many banks are taking the stance that it's really impossible to support real-time payments through a batch process. And as a result, they can only make real-time payments available through an API, which makes reasonable sense. But the second part of that, and the one that I think is more interesting to Treasury, is around getting real-time reporting. I think this is the genesis of your question, is how does that impact Treasury? Why should Treasury care about APIs in real time? Most treasurers have shown a reluctance to be that interested in real-time payments. And why would you want to pay in real time? You know when that needs to be paid by. Same day ACH or even next day can certainly do the trick. What does a real-time payment really mean? And there's certain use cases for it, but for the most part, Treasury doesn't care. On real-time reporting, though, this is a bit of a game changer. We've seen instances of more real-time reporting, especially with global organizations that have multiple treasury centers. They have this follow the sun approach where, what is the prior day file? And that's a question that starts to come up for global organizations. But for all treasury organizations, this idea of real-time bank reporting, where what is the intraday statement? What is intraday reporting? Is it a file that's at the same time as your first presentment and second presentment? Or is it a stream of information that literally every time there's a transaction that occurs, debit or credit, you see it provided into your TMS and your ERP? And that's the position that most banks are starting to take. Now, they're assessing the demand for this in focus groups and whatnot, and we certainly converse with them from a Kyriba perspective to represent what our corporate clients are looking for. But the general consensus is that there's a lot of people that look in their bank statement, or I should say not their bank statement, their bank site, to see, did this transaction happen? And a lot of times that's on receipts, but sometimes it's payables too. But generally it's in receipts. Did this come in? Did it come in? And through an API, this real-time bank reporting can make that happen downstream so that you don't have to look anywhere else. It's immediately in your cash position. It's immediately in your ERP, and you don't have to worry about this embargoed, time-stamped bank statement or bank file. So, yeah, Craig, I think it's a very reasonable question. This idea of real-time bank reporting leads to real-time cash management. When do we start making these decisions? Is 10 a.m. the right time to do investing and borrowing? Or is this something that actually iterates throughout the entire day? It's an interesting question as we get technology that allows us to become more real-time in Treasury.
Thinking through some of your comments there and what's changing, if payments are all in batch mode, they're the historical methods, they post at night. We have things like checks that only settle once or twice a day, first and second presentment. We have ACHs that are 2-day or 1 day. They post on a nightly basis. Faster reporting means there's nothing else to report on except maybe wires. But as more of those payments become faster, they become real-time, same day, then the reporting of those transactions can follow, and everything can move to 24/5, 24/6, 24/7 with movement of funds and with reporting. That's an interesting connection that I think you're making. So with the fact that everything's moving faster, what should we think about it, but I think you've described how we should be thinking about this increase in speed. But what should we be doing or preparing for?
The jump to real-time treasury and real-time payments especially, which is going to drive that, is we have to recognize what is going to lead what. no treasurer really cares about real-time payments, as I mentioned before, at least not in the degree that it's going to make it into a mass adoption. We care about getting cash in real time. We care about receipts. And so as a result, we need to start recognizing that if we're demanding payments to be made in real time, we're going to have to expect that we're going to be able to make payments in real time, because our customers will demand that of us, or our suppliers will demand it of us, So as that cycle continues, we need to appreciate that if we're going to have receipts and payments in real time, we need reporting in real time, and we need to make cash decisions in real time. So what should we prepare for? We should prepare for the fact that if we are paying and receiving in real time, we need data in real time. And you have to have your downstream processes and systems ready for that. If your treasury system or your ERP isn't ready for that, your spreadsheets, if you're using those instead, aren't ready for real-time information immediately, then you have a bit of a visibility problem that you're going to need to solve. So I think you need to look at what's the actual series of steps. What are the dominoes that fall when I get a payment in real time or I get a receipt in real time? What needs to happen for me to be efficient and not have a time of day process that suddenly stops everything in its tracks? So what do we need to become real time in treasury to react to this, I think, is the biggest preparation step.
Faster payments will lead to faster cash positioning, lead to faster cash forecasting, lead to faster reconciliation and faster accounting, and the use of a lot of systems to support that.
Yeah, it's a world of immediacy, which, in fairness, in our personal lives, we're pretty much a part of right now. We need to expect that this is going to be part of our professional lives also.
Bob, thanks so much for joining me on this free-range discussion, the free-range check-in with Kyriba's Bob Stark.
Craig, thank you very much. It was a pleasure and fun.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.